Hi guys, welcome back to another book discussion. Today, I will be discussing Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is a compilation of short stories, including White Nights, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, selections from The House of the Dead, and the main story, Notes from Underground. This is one of my best reads this year. I give this book 5 stars. I really enjoyed reading this book. I find it quite humorous and just a breath of fresh air because before this book I read Crime and Punishment last year, or was it the year before that? But I read Crime and Punishment from Dostoyevsky, and then this year I read the brothers Karamazov, and those two books aren't to be taken lightly. Before I talk about Notes from Underground, which is really the story that brought this book to another level for me, I want to talk first about some notable short stories. This edition is from Signet Classics. It's the 150th anniversary edition. So I don't know if other editions included other stories or it's just Notes from Underground, but this one included some other works from Dostoyevsky. Now, the very first story in this book is called White Nights, which is surprisingly a romance story or a love story. I'm not really a fan of love stories. I think I've established that in this channel already, but I still enjoyed reading that because of the conversation, because of the dialogues actually between two of the characters, and they talked a lot about deeper topics.
Hi, so it's the next day. I didn't finish filming because I received the package and I started reading the book that I got. I received my copy of the BTS book, Beyond the Story, 10-Year Record of BTS, and yeah, I've been reading that. I have a lot to say, and I'm quite surprised that that book has been out since July 9 and no one has reviewed it. So I guess people are buying it for the sake of buying it. I guess it's a collector's edition. Might as well be a collector's edition because I am at page over 100 now, and the translation, the presentation, it's not giving me the same quality that BTS is known for. There was even a typographical error. So I had a lot to say about that book, but I'll reserve that for another video.
For the meantime, let's go back to Notes from Underground. I was talking about White Nights the last time, and I just want to say that my favorite part from that story was the conversation about the definition of being a dreamer. Reading this book particularly, you get to know Dostoevsky as the author, him as a person. Finishing this book, I can definitely say that I relate to him very much. I think if we have a conversation, it will be really deep, really meaningful, and I'll get a lot from him. Reading White Nights definitely gave me that vibe. As I was saying, his definition of being a dreamer is he's defining himself and he's defining me, particularly when he said, "When I say he watches, I am wrong. He takes it in distractedly." A friend of mine once said that I always seem like I'm thinking about something, and in the middle of a conversation or just having coffee or hanging out silently, I'd open up a topic about a really random question, and it gives off that impression that I'm always in deep thoughts. When Dostoevsky said this, I really find myself in his description. He said, "You speak beautifully, but couldn't you please speak less beautifully? You sound as though you were reading aloud from a book." I like that. I wish people still talk like that. Very romantic way of talking. Not romantic like cheesy romance, but like romantic in a way that it's sweet, you know, it's fragile. You know, I wish people still talk like that, like the old times. But conversation these days are very surface level, and most of the time just nonsense, and the way they choose their words as well, it lacks flavor, in my opinion. It just feels emotionless. It feels, I don't know, like effortless and plain and bland, and it makes me not want to talk to people more, and I'm already on the verge of pulling myself away from social interactions, mainly because I just get bored of people talk and communicate. It's just not interesting to me. It makes it hard for me to approach people, and most especially for others to approach me. That's always been my problem. But yeah, that's White Nights. So now I want to talk about another story from this book, and the title is In the Hospital. And I'm gonna skip two other stories in this book because those did not really appeal to me. But In the Hospital reminded me a lot of Crime and Punishment. There is a lot of observation, trying to define what punishment is and what it's really about, that it's not necessarily physical. I know that Dostoyevsky was imprisoned for a while, so maybe this is his account of that, his observations, his journal and reflection. It talks about tyranny in this story. One thing that he noted and that I really liked, he turned the perspective to the flogger or the punisher, and he described, or he focused more on that person's punishment more so than the actual punished or the victim. The flogger, according to Dostoevsky, is also being punished, and his punishment is so much worse, and he's also a prisoner. It sheds light to the fact that the narrative can be altered, and depending on how you see it or how you see the situation, or which camera do you look at? Do you look at the flogger, or do you look at the prisoner? Do you look at the punisher or the punished? But each of these persons are also vulnerable. They have insecurities, they have their own sort of inner conflict, and it makes you not judge anyone really, no matter how bad or good they are, where they stand. That each of these people has a story, and it's unfair for us to judge them. The next story that I want to talk about is called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, a fantasy. The first two stories I talked about are more on the serious topics in this book, but The Dream of a Ridiculous Man and Notes from Underground, I would say, are like the humorous part, or the humorous ones, the funnier ones, but funny in a way of sarcasm and just a passive aggressiveness kind of humor that I'm really into, actually. And so that's why it really appealed to me. That's why I really liked it. The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, again, I related very much because I often feel the same way. There is a line here that goes, "If only I could have answered some of the many questions that tormented me, but I hadn't found a single answer. Then I became indifferent to everything, and all the questions faded away." I often find answer, or I sought answers to questions that I've asked all my life. I live my life in search of those answers. And as instruments, as tools, I read books, I diversify my thoughts, I am open minded, I listen to contradicting ideas. And because I know, or I've absorbed so much of both sides, it does put me in this predicament where I no longer know the answer, and there is really no point in finding that answer because I understand both sides, and that inability to pick a side creates this lazy effect where I just don't care anymore. I just become this very indecisive person which in some conversations can be seen as like a bad trait or a toxic trait. It seems as if Dostoyevsky is in self-pity. He's reflecting. He said, it seems obvious that if I am still a man and not a zero, then as long as I haven't turned into a zero, I am living. I think that's a really nice mindset. That's also the mindset that I go for. There is this line that really stuck with me. I heard it somewhere from the radio. I just don't know who said it. But someone from the radio said it. He might have borrowed it somewhere else. But he said, just keep your head above water. And that line really stuck with me because whenever you feel like drowning, not to be taken literally, but drowning in thoughts or drowning in regrets or drowning in embarrassment, in failure, whenever you're stuck in that situation, you just have to keep your head above water. You know, as long as you're not zero, according to Dostoevsky, then you're fine, you're good, you are living and you're fine, you'll get better. That line really stuck with me. That could also be interpreted to take one day at a time. If you worry about your whole life, a year of your life, a month of your life, what's happening next week, what's happening tomorrow, you're really going to drown, or at least you'll feel like you're drowning. But keeping your head above water can also be interpreted as just survive the day, just survive today, you know, and tomorrow you wake up and you survive that day. Before you know it, a month has passed, a year has passed. There is also a part here that this book actually reminded me a lot, like similar concepts to, or similar ideas to, similar philosophy to one of my favorite books, Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. I really like that book because it sort of summarized everything for me, and it boils down to his point that there are no answers and you shouldn't seek answers because there aren't any. This wisdom that you've earned, do not try to interpret that. Do not try to pass it off because it cannot be transferred. It cannot be shared because words aren't enough to express what wisdom is about. And Dostoevsky also touched on that topic when he said, I don't know how to organize a paradise on earth because I cannot convey it in words. And that is true. Siddhartha also mentioned this, like, knowledge is the only thing that you can pass on because knowledge can be interpreted in words, but wisdom cannot be interpreted in words. Herman has talked about distrust of words and communication because they are limited. The meaning gets limited and it's impossible to encapsulate the meaning of an idea into a word. Dostoevsky also saw that, I guess. Now we're finally in the main story, and the title is Notes from Underground, the title story of this book. And this one is very special. I've talked about this in like my vlog when I was reading this, how much this really reflected my own thoughts when Dostoevsky said that I'm guilty of being more intelligent than all those around me, and all my life I have never been able to look people straight in the eye. I always feel I need to avert my face. And then I'm also guilty because even if there had been any forgiveness in me, it would have only increased my torment because I would have been conscious of its uselessness. You know, this Notes from Underground is really a look into Dostoevsky's brain. There is a lot of confusion and conflict and just contradicting ideas, and that created this confusion in his mind, which resulted in his indecisiveness and inability to take sides, and just that constant battle and back and forth of ideas. As portrayed in Notes from Underground, he coped with it by sarcasm, and that turns into humor, and humor thus becomes his defense mechanism or his means for living, or means of survival, or means of keeping sane. I think this line here really summarized this whole story when he said Deep down, of course, I couldn't quite believe in my suffering and felt like laughing. When you've reached that point where everything just becomes a joke, the best thing about life is when you've reached that point where you can laugh about everything. I think you've surpassed the worst stage. I don't think it's a curse. I think it's a blessing because other people don't even get there. Other people can't get there. And that's where people differ, I guess. This part really reminded me of this line from Ender's Game by, who said it? Oscar Gard, I think. I don't remember, but it's one of the books that changed the way I think. There is a line there. I'm gonna tell you the gist because I don't know verbatim, but when you learn or when you try to understand your enemy, you empathize thus with your enemy, or you learn to understand your enemy, and your heart goes to that enemy, and in the end you can no longer hate your enemy. Hate thus becomes impossible. Dostoyevsky touched on that when he said, as I think the anger vanishes, the reason for it evaporates. The responsible person is never found. The insult becomes an insult no longer, but a stroke of fate. I feel the same way. I always wondered why I don't get angry for an extended time. And I hate myself for that because I can't act on it after a few days because my anger vanishes. Because at the end of the day, I try to understand my enemy or the other party. And when I try to understand where that person is coming from or why he acted that way, then I come to understand him and empathize with him, and I see myself in him, and I understand why he did what he had to do. And I no longer hate him for that. And I really hate that part of me. Like, I can't stay angry. Dostoevsky definitely felt the same way with anger. This is funny though. This is the part where I just started laughing out loud. He's spitting facts. He said, you know, ladies and gentlemen, probably the only reason why I think I'm an intelligent man is that in all my life I've never managed to start or finish anything. I kind of feel the same way. It's funny. I think it's an exaggeration, but still true. And I think this book really is an exaggeration, but speaks honesty, and it translates as humorous. And because of that, it's really impossible not to love this book. There is another quote here that I really like. I resigned myself, accepting things rather than really getting used to them. That is the best way to recovery. I've talked about A Little Life by Yanagihara in this channel, where I talked about an advice coming from that book where you get used to something, that's when you recover. And I really despised that idea, and I talked about how much I despised it in my book discussion. This line right here, when Dostoevsky said this is what I think is the best advice. This is, in my opinion, the best advice: to accept it rather than getting used to it, and like just absorb it, let it soak, let yourself be angry, be sad, and feel all those emotions. And by the time that you're talking about it and you find yourself laughing about it, I think that's the time when you've actually recovered. There is no proper way to recover. I guess there is no like written rule, but I think this system or this sort of practice is the least toxic out of all ways. Another quote here: I couldn't even conceive of being second best. That's why in real life I resigned myself so easily to being last. There is a movie, I think, or a TV show that I saw. I can't remember which one, but there is a dialogue there, part of the dialogue, a line that goes, he hates being placed second and he'd rather be placed third, because when he places third, at least he'd feel lucky and thankful that he's still placed. But if you're placed second, it's actually so much worse because you know for a fact that you could have been first. I don't necessarily feel like that. Everything that I've seen, heard, absorbed over the years really just forms into this network in my head, and I connect each of them. And I think that's when everything pays off. Moments like this, when for example, I talk to a person and that person says something and I relate that to a book or a movie or a conversation, that moment, I know that everything that I've absorbed all my life pays off. Reading this book, I can connect this to many other resources that I've accumulated over the years. I really like this book because it's philosophical, but it's sarcastic philosophical, it's lighthearted, it's humorous, and it's thin. That's the most important part. And I really, really recommend this book.